The Agile Toolkit.
So I'd like to introduce George Dinwiddie and Bob Payne. I've known them for quite some time. George has a consulting company called IDIA Computing, if I remember that correctly.
Right.
And Bob is a vice president at Lightspeed.
Yep.
And they're going to do what is both an entertaining and enlightening.
We can guarantee at least one of those.
So both, it's the double E, to entertaining and enlightening, demonstration on how the interactions between a product owner, a tester, and the types of things that go on in development around having test-driven development and so forth work. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys. So thank you all very much.
Great, thank you, Paul.
Yay.
So, George, what are we going to talk about?
So there's sort of two levels of testing that we're going to deal with. One is the unit testing level, test-driven development, and the other is at the business level, acceptance test-driven development. So we're going to be playing three roles up here. We're going to be playing the role of the product owner, the role of the tester, and the role of the programmer.
Yeah, so watch the hats because the tester and product owner might change. So whoever's wearing the developer hat is the developer.
And if we get confused and wear the wrong hat, let us know.
Yeah.
So,
just like a matrix organization, it's tough to wear many hats.
And so we're going to start off down at the, a little exercise about test-driven development, because the exercise we've got with code doesn't really have enough code to get down to test-driven development very much.
Or in the time slot allotted. So who has a reasonable description of test-driven development? Who's willing to go out on a limb? I know at least a couple of you here can.
Code written such that it fails first and then you write the code to pass it.
Yeah, so we want to write a small test, and in theory, the smallest test that could possibly fail. We're going to then do what, George?
And then see it fail.
See it fail. That is a key component of this practice.
Then do just enough to make it pass.
So if we think about that, we're going to write a failing test. We're going to write a little bit of code that will make it pass, and then we're going to ratchet it up with another failing test. When I mean simple, I quite often mean very simple. Call a method and assert that it does not blow up, that you can just even call it. Don't even assert anything about its return. And then through the process of writing a small test that fails, making that test pass, say what is that next test that I could write that would tell me what the code needs to do. Write that, fail it, write a little bit of code so that it passes. And now I have my blue hat on. Anybody know what the blue hat signifies? Hmm? You can refactor.
So if you don't keep refactoring, then as you go in and make lots of little changes, then the cruft builds up pretty quickly. And when we get down to the code part, you can see some of that. So you have to keep it clean. You have to keep it as simple as possible, or it becomes harder and harder to write new code, harder and harder to move forward, and slower.
There are two confusing words in the phrase test-driven development. One is test, because it sounds like it's a testing practice. Now, we end up with 100% or nearly 100% unit test coverage, and I think we can all agree that that is a great thing, but it is fundamentally a development practice. It is not a testing practice. What's the other confusing one?
So driven. A lot of times people, certainly I did when I started out doing test-driven development, then I've got a design in my head that I'm trying to end up with, and I write tests that require it to be that design, rather than writing tests that require the outputs and the capabilities to be what I want the system to do. And one of the key points in my doing test-driven development was the time when I let that go a little bit. I ended up with a design that was different from the one that I started with in my head. And it was a better design. It was simpler, it was more robust, and it was because I was listening to the tests and having them specify behavior I wanted out of the code, rather than thinking of it as a test to make sure that this design was working correctly.
Yeah, and in fact, some people have started talking about it in this idea of test-driven design rather than test-driven development. So remember, it's a development practice. It has extraordinarily short cycles. You end up with very robust unit test coverage, generally 3 times more or more lines of test code than you do for regular code, and you've created a scaffolding that allows you to refactor the design mercilessly, knowing that the system behavior hasn't changed, even though the internals of the code have changed. It sounds crazy. It is crazy powerful, and most people don't do it, right? So one of the things that we'd like for you to think about is how can we maybe experiment with this in the organizations that we're in? How can we try to bring that in? Do we want to contract for it? People that know and are going to exhibit test-driven design behavior. Yes.
So if we know most people don't do it, do we know why? Is it because it's just a...
It explodes their head. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reasons.
I took a test-driven development course through Learning Tree, and that was what I found. My head didn't explode, but it felt like it. It was just now you basically for X number of years I've been trained to requirements, design, develop, test, and now you're basically saying requirements, test, design, then code, so it was.
So when you get in a hurry, what do? You do what you've always done because it's familiar and you don't have to think about it, and you're in a hurry, and that's the number one thing that keeps people from doing it.
I find, yes, sorry.
But the other thing is it doesn't make sense at first.
Right.
And this is when I first discovered extreme programming. This was the one, everything else made sense to me, and a lot of it agreed with how I worked when I got to work the way I wanted to work. But this test-driven development stuff did make sense, because how could I write a test for something that didn't exist yet? And so the people I admire who obviously find value in this, I should try it out. And so I did. And I tried it out, and 3 days was enough to convince me that one, I could do it, and two, it was helpful.
Okay.
And then I've spent all the time since the last 15 years getting better at it.
I find that the people that engage with this, and this is a biased view, obviously, but the folks that engage with it become much better developers than they were when they started, because 2 things happen. You're focused on what the system needs to do now, rather than trying to boil the ocean and understand who might use this code in the future, right? You're focused on now, you're focused on clean code, and you're focused on fully tested.
So my second question is if you're a developer, is everything test DD, or is it like Agile? Every project is not necessarily a good candidate for Agile. So is every code that you're about to write not a good candidate? Yeah,
so the problem with taking an all or nothing approach with a new team with TDD is usually back to nothing, right? You're better off. So if you say it's all or nothing, your most likely outcome is nothing, right? So it is a very good practice if you can hire folks that already have that skill set. They're going to help bring the rest of your team up. But use it as an experiment. And so right now we're gonna try just sort of a thought experiment. We're gonna do a little tiny TDD with the dominoes. So dump the dominoes out on your table. And then we're gonna talk about a TDD when we hit the code, because I realize we have Just a half hour.
That's what I said.
Okay. So, what we're going to talk about, I'm going to start to test drive this using some Gherkin tests, and you'll see that when we write our Selenium tests. But we're testing this test-driven Domino TDD feature, if you will, scenario. So here's my first failing test. So you've got all of the pieces in front of you. So when I call the Domino service with the hello Domino, then it should return 3 dominoes. So from the middle of your pile, grab 3 dominoes.
Everybody or just one person?
Everybody. Well, yeah, at your table. There's only one solution at the table, so. Hold your hand up when your test is passing. At your table? Great. So that test has gone green, right? So we went from red test to green test. Now we've added another red test. And the total number of spots on the domino are even. On all 3 dominoes. So add them up. The spots on the dominoes need to be even.
So what about the, and they are arranged in a strict, did you skip that one?
Ah, I skipped one. And they are arranged in a, I clicked twice.
Okay.
And they are arranged in a rectangular shape. Sorry, thank you. Okay? And the total number of spots are even? No? Hold it. You can refactor your code if they are not currently even. So swap out the pieces that you need. Add some code to make it pass. Swap code, refactor it. So you're in a refactoring mode
So
now.
you need to make sure that all of these still, you need to make sure that all of these are still true.
Yep. The other ones still need to pass. Everybody got that one? Okay. Now, each domino in your set, you still are returning 3. They're all even. And each domino contains numbers that represent an integer, such as 2, and its double, 4. Hold your hand up when it's done. Everybody hands up? It's got it correct. Okay. Excellent. Everybody have a solution? Okay.
No.
Oh, sorry. George can help out. You need to pair program back there.
Oh, pairing. Oh, I didn't know preparing.
And no individual face, so if you look at the half, is greater than 5. So this half of the domino, no one is greater than 5.
Double?
0 and 0.
And
Nothing double, nothing.
now remember, all your tests should pass. Let me know when you have a solution. Do you have a solution? Okay. For all the tests? They're even?
Yeah.
And you have none greater than 5. Now what you may find is one of your tests is now going to fail. There is a solution for it with not greater than 5, but one of your tests is going to fail.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So the solution I'm thinking of is 1 and 2, 2 and 4, and 0, 0. That is its double. 0 is the double of 0. Okay? So, but we've got a failing test. So the question is, why is this test failing? It was a test I wrote earlier.
This test is up here.
What's that? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So what have I just learned from this failing test? I don't know. Right? Clearly, we've got something that can't. You've got conflicting requirements. It's a requirements error, or it's a design error, right? It could be that some other caller of this service requires an even number. It causes me to stop and think and figure out what I need to do.
It's washing out a little bit back.
Okay.
That's fine.
So
There you go.
I realized that this was an incorrect assumption. It could be even.
How's our camera? Did you wash up in the camera?
That's okay. We're good. Yep. So that is a little example, a non-code example of trying to drive my design out with TDD. It's not a perfect analogy, right? Because code is different. We had some refactoring. We added a little incremental test and had to change the return as we built that test up little by little. Questions, thoughts, concerns?
I was like, I know I got a question. So did you know, I guess, the objective before you started? In other words, what were you trying to? Because you put that up, you put the scenario up.
I did, yeah.
I know this is a non-code example.
Right.
But did you have a requirement, so to speak? Did you?
Yes. So if I were coding a particular object, I would kind of have a rough idea. Now the beautiful thing is I can start to think, rather than what does this thing need to do in its entirety, the first one I say is what method do I need and who's going to interact with it. The second thing I ask myself is what are they calling me with? Right? I start to do that design thinking earlier and in smaller chunks. And that is also a really powerful behavior.
And from the outside in.
And from the outside in.
You think about your code from the point of view of the code that's calling it, not just what you need to do internally.
Right.
And that's one of the powerful pieces that gives you a better design.
Okay.
You can never write a 1,500 line, I suppose you might be able to, method, which I've seen in production using this method, because you would just explode the tests. I mean, it's almost impossible.
You can't get to the code to write tests around it if it's all chunked up in 1,500 lines. So this is another thing. If you write your test first and then make it pass, you always end up with testable code.
Yeah, you can't, like, test afterwards, you're like, oh, shoot. You might not say shoot. Pick the expletive of your choice, zonkers. I can't test it, right? So what's that result in? Am I going to rewrite the code? Probably not. Results in lower test coverage on this. Or maybe just the bare minimum to allow me to check in, right? Rather than starting with the test first.